So welcome everybody. Thank you for making this possible by joining. If you guys didn't join, this would have stopped happening a long time ago, I imagine. So it's nice that we're all here together today. Today is also what was the last day of the last intensive, which was titled "The End of Shoulds and Shouldn'ts." And so given that a group of dedicated seekers and myself have spent 6 satsangs talking about the topic, it seems appropriate to maybe try and give a summary of what it was all about. When I put out the notion of the intensives, I wasn't quite sure if it would be attractive to people, given that there are the weekly satsangs on. And luckily people signed up. And as now we've had 3 of them, I think, and it becomes apparent that there is a value in it, in that it talks about a particular topic, a particular section of the teaching in an intense way. Just so I thought actually the name intensive is very appropriate. So it is an intensive repetition of the same topic, looking at it from different angles each day. And after 6 days, you can't help but you can't miss the topic that is being spoken about, because it's been repeated in each satsang for 6 days in a row. So, at first I thought, someone could just download or watch 6 satsangs on YouTube. But if that was the case, then, you'd get 1 satsang on the general framework, maybe 1 on meditation, maybe 1 on shoulds and shouldn'ts, maybe 1 on energetic movements, another 1 on models. And each one is taking a look at a much bigger picture from a different angle. And so I think the intensives are worthwhile. So if anyone wants to join the upcoming ones, feel free. And there are the recordings of the past intensives available. And the details of those are on the website. If anyone wants to order a copy of the recordings, then that's a possibility. So check out the website. So this one, as I mentioned, was the end of shoulds and shouldn'ts. And it's a bit of a tricky topic to talk about, because it can seem like it is very much about circumstance. It can seem like it's about improving circumstance. And it can also seem like it's forgetting the overriding concept that we are not the doers, and promoting an attitude of, I can change my life. It can seem like that on the surface. And so when discussing the topic, it can be tricky, and the trick is to ensure that what is said is qualified enough to ensure that it doesn't sound like we're no longer seeing life as a happening, we're no longer seeing it as God's will. Because some of the concepts, when it comes to the end of shoulds and shouldn'ts, suggests you doing things differently. You letting go of an old way of making decisions, an old way of moving through life. And as is the case with all of the concepts, this is where it's important for me to reiterate, even if the words sound like, or the language not only sounds like, but implies, and in some cases it says, do this, do that. If it sounds like that, it's still just a description and not a prescription. So what does that mean? It might sound like I'm telling someone to do something, but really it's a description of what might happen. So an example of that is that the doer principle inside of us, the one that really deeply down believes that things don't happen on their own, that life isn't happening automatically, that things that happen through this body-mind and the outcomes that happen because of what the body does are all orchestrated and a result of a separate independent entity that chooses of its own volition. So deep down, that is one of the misunderstandings that exists as part of the default development in psychological structure within a human being. And so and the other part is attachment to outcome, that really, truly, deep down believes my contentment, a contentment that we don't tend to have as part of the ordinary human condition, the ordinary standard development of a human puts in place a psychological entity, which I'm speaking about, that doesn't feel content. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like it's in resistance to life. And that's because part of that psychological entity has the deep ingrained belief that its happiness is dependent on perfection. And life, from the point of view of the individual with preferences, a set of preferences that it is attached to being delivered, from that point of view, life is not perfect, because life is a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And so that entity, that psychological identity, which is really a deeply ingrained set of belief systems that get layered, sort of layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, very slowly but surely, and this belief system gets laid down essentially by not an individual doer, but rather by life experience that arises in each moment. You know, the baby is born and it is aware of life, and essentially that is experience of life. And then there's the experience of bodily pleasure and pain, and being fed, being hungry, being tired, being sick, seeing all of this movement. And as it is exposed to more and more of that, and as the intellect develops, an idea, conclusion about what life is and what the baby is starts to get solidified and starts to get laid down. And we can see it's not something that the baby as a separate independent entity is doing. It's just a consequence of life experience, how the body is experienced, and what the intellect concludes based on its capacity to conclude. So it's a very subconscious sense of self that gets set in place. And by the time a person is 2.5 years old, a fairly solid sense of self has set in. And it's a psychological self, it's a conceptual self, it's a self based on how life has been interpreted from a fairly limited point of view, right? The 2.5 years up to that point, where language has been learned or started to be learned, and at about 2.5 to 3, the me and the mind sets in, where a child really starts to have a sense of who it is, or at least who it believes it is, and then starts claiming ownership over the things that it thinks will nourish it. And as soon as those things are taken away, it reacts as if it is an attack on itself, as if those things being taken away are killing it, going to kill it in some way, which is why the tantrums happen. So this identity that is attached to the best things in life, what it thinks the best life can offer, it wants that. It thinks that's where its contentment will exist. And so when a description is given in a teaching, it's not often heard as a description. So an example of that is peace of mind is available. So that's a description. Peace of mind is available. It's like saying traffic lights have a red light and a green light. It's a description. It's sort of saying that's one of the characteristics. So it says peace of mind is available, just a description. The doer that is attached to the best life has to offer says, oh, so he's telling me to get it. He's telling me I should have it, which is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it is available, but not of our doing. It's available, it does exist, but it's not necessarily available for everyone, because everyone has their own destiny and their destiny is unfolding, but it does unfold. So it's a possibility. It can happen. So then another description is this peace of mind that is a possibility. In practice, when we really look at what is peace of mind, it isn't a positive feeling of joy or a positive something that is added in that we can say, oh, now I feel at peace. And when we say I feel at peace, usually we imagine the presence of a peaceful feeling, which is the addition of a feeling of peace. And when we look at it more closely, we find that no, peace is the absence of an uncomfortableness, the absence of suffering. And so the description says this peace of mind that is available is the end of suffering. When suffering stops, that is peace of mind. And so the doer that is attached to pleasure says, I want this, it is available, I'm going to get it, and he's telling me to stop suffering. He's telling me to stop doing suffering. That's how I will get this great thing. So the sense of doership hears words as prescriptions, especially things it likes. It's saying, I like it, and therefore I'm going to get it, and Roger is telling me how to get it. Never. That's never the case. Why it's not the case is because over and over and over again we're saying that the teaching is saying life is a happening. There is no doer. I, Roger, am not the doer of the speaking. The speaking is happening as a result of factors outside of the conscious Roger's control. The conscious Roger that arises, the sense of Roger, the Roger that is aware of what is happening, is not in control of what is happening. What is happening is a very complex output, or what happens is very complex output. And so Roger becomes aware of the awareness and conscious aspect of Roger, is aware of the speaking, is aware of the thinking, is aware of the actions. But before all of that, there's the source of that, the creator of that. And it's very easy for the conscious Roger that becomes aware of the speaking to say, I did that. Because that's what it feels like. It feels like I am the speaker. It takes, awareness to land on what is being pointed at, and destiny to allow a seeing, destiny to make a seeing happen, of this impersonal movement of life, such that eventually what also happens is the falling away of the belief in doership. So Roger isn't telling another person that he thinks can actually make things happen of their own volition. He isn't saying, stop suffering, but rather is putting out conditioning that are really just descriptions, just information. Descriptions is information. So if we hear the description, the hot plate is dangerous. The hot plate is hot. It's not saying don't put your hand on the hot plate or put your hand on the hot plate. It's just stating the fact. It's just information. And it doesn't have to be information given to a doer. It can be valuable information if received by an intellect, received by a robot, received by a machine. Because that information going in may actually be part of the programming of the machine, and then the machine functions according to its programming. And if that's the case, if we really are like this, it's one machine being an instrument of life, delivering new conditioning, or delivering conditioning in the moment, information in the moment, that when received by another machine that is in the environment, and the information is part of the environment, that becomes part of the programming of that machine. But we don't know how the programming is going to land. Neither the machine throwing out the information, nor the machine receiving the information. We see it, how it landed, based on what comes next. What happens next. The thoughts that might start arising in that as an output of that programmed machine. So that's why the speaking happens, because it's understood that life happens as a result, or change happens, or life unfolds. Life is always change. So life unfolds as a result of the instrument, the human instruments, functioning in each moment exactly as they're destined to function. So all of this to say that even when I might say, be talking to the person, it might sound like, oops, Roger has forgotten that everything is happening according to God's will and is now telling the person what to do. But how God's will unfolds, is through the functioning of the instruments in life that are part of life and programmed and designed by life. So if we think God's will happens independent of circumstance, we've misinterpreted what it means by everything happens according to God's will. We imagine God's will being out there, separate from what is happening here. And so then we think, oh, well, if something's going to happen, if someone is destined to get a job, then they don't need to do anything for that job or that destiny to eventuate, because God will just make it happen. And so the imagination is the letter will just appear in the letterbox saying, oh, we would like you to have this job. Now, the letter could appear in the letterbox, and that would be God's will unfolding, but the letter will usually appear in the letterbox after the person has had the urge to apply for a job that they heard about, for example. And so that urge to apply for the job is part of the unfolding of life, which is God's will. The receiving of the letter in the mail also is God's will, and that's how God's will happens, through what seem to be my actions. So this is where the saying of trust in God, but tether your camel, tie up your camel. Obviously a very old saying, and Sufi or Islamic saying, probably, because it's something that probably originated in areas in the Middle East, let's say, where camels are maybe the equivalent of horses in another part of the world. So the saying didn't originate in, Japan, because it doesn't apply to Japan. Trust in God, but tie up your camel. Meaning, this notion, and it's there because the mistake often happens, right? That when we hear about God's will, which is an important principle in teachings, it's part of what allows the psychological identity that gets developed to start being dissolved, because another explanation of how things happen in life, God's will, is presented to allow the psychological identity that is trying to control life to understand that the two concepts are incompatible with each other. And so the notion of God's will can weaken and ultimately bring a complete collapse to the idea I am a separate doer in control of everything that I do. And in that process, very often the paradox I describe, the paradox of how God's will unfolds, as in it unfolds through the actions of you and me happening in order for a particular outcome to happen, a destined outcome. Often that paradox isn't seen, and there is just this mistake that happens that, God's will is going to happen by, through a magic wand type effect. And we can look at life unfolding as a magic wand happening, but the waving of the magic wand is happening in the background, moving all of the characters for them to do in each moment what they are destined to do. So it says, trust in God, but at the same time tie up your camel. It means not to say, I trust that God is looking after me and that my destiny isn't for my camel to run away, so I don't need to tie it up. Because what happens is the person will go off to the watering hole or whatever, come back, and the camel won't be there. And they'll sort of say, hang on a sec, this trust I have is misguided. I shouldn't trust in God because I leave my camel here and it runs off. And if that person were to seek clarity from God, hey God, how come you let my camel run off? I have trust in you. And he said, and God might say, yes, I am the one that provided the rope and provided you with the capacity to know how to tie a knot. And so trusting in God means do what makes sense in the scheme of life, knowing that that is God's will. So to hammer this point home, there is also a joke, or is it a joke or another parable, of a man in a rainstorm and the levels start rising, and a four-wheel drive Jeep type thing comes along and says, come on, hop in, this is getting dangerous. And he says, no, I trust in God. And the water levels rise a bit higher, and a small boat comes past and says, he's on the second floor of his house by now, on the balcony. And the guy says, come on, hop in, we have space for you. No, I trust in God. So the boat carries on. Then he's on the roof of his house. The waters have risen that high. And a helicopter comes past and drops the ladder down. Come on, jump on. This is your last chance. This is really not a good situation. I know it's not a good situation, but I trust in God. Eventually the water levels rise. The man dies, finds himself in heaven, goes to seek clarity from God. God, what's going on? I'm one of your most loyal followers. I have this deep trust in God that you will look after me. And this is it, I drowned. And God says, listen, what more could I do? I sent you a Jeep, then I sent you a boat, then I sent you a helicopter. You didn't take any of my help. And so this parable demonstrates how the character here was expecting God's hand to come down from the heavens and pluck him off the roof with God's hand and place him on dry land. And in practice, God's will happens in very ordinary ways, in daily living ways. Because life as we know it is an expression of God, a creation of God. God is not separate from what is happening. Now, when I'm using the word God, I don't mean the religious God. Religions tend to include many layers of teaching in them, and the one that people are most familiar with often is the most dualistic, most simple form of the teaching that essentially is preliminary, and as understanding goes deeper, we can see in the teachings themselves a much deeper meaning. And so the rudimentary explanations, the surface explanations, become seen as metaphors, and then a deeper meaning can be seen in it. And so often the God of religion, the God of the religion of the average person, is not that great a representation of what comes to be known as God when the understanding goes deeper. God is really just a word, and source might be a better word. Source has less dogma attached to it. It's got less ideas passed down from parents. Most parents have a fairly superficial idea of God based on the explanations, the sort of explanations I'm talking about. A God that is going to judge you, a God that loves you but will punish you with a life of damnation, a God that is all-powerful and somewhat has an image of a human being. And so there's a lot of contradictions in that idea of God. So if we use the word God, it's useful as long as we have a new definition, a new understanding, not just a definition someone has given you, but a definition that stems from an understanding that has transcended this personal God, this separate God, and now has a God that is much more impersonal, much less separate from life. And so source or consciousness may be better words to use. And in this teaching framework, the whole of the top-down teachings are summed up by saying source at rest, or consciousness at rest, is in its potential form. So that is potential before the manifestation, which is the experience of life, or the world of form, or the experience of the world of form that we know, the universe, let's say. Before that creation came into existence, God, source, energy, consciousness, was in its potential form, in its unmanifest form. And the unmanifest, we can say, is absolutely nothing. It is in its potential, so it hasn't become anything. And often when we think of nothing, we think of emptiness, as in something we can see, like space, empty space without the planets and all of that, just empty space. Whereas absolute nothing is the absence of even that space. So you can imagine the space closing in on itself till there is nothing, and not even any space that nothing exists in. Pretty hard for our brain that is so used to seeing everything, and even when we imagine before all of this, we imagine a big empty or a space full of hot gases, for example, if we're working on the Big Bang type of theory. So before even that, before space came into existence, absolute nothing. So the teaching says, source at rest is in its potential form. And because it's potential, at some point it has to actualize. Otherwise it would be dead nothing instead of potential nothing. And at some point it actualizes. And so the actualization is the potential energy becoming the manifestation. The manifestation as it exists in each moment. So that energy is continually morphing through or becoming the story of life in each moment. So we could say the initial impulse, the energy went from at rest to this explosion. And then the explosion unfolded over what we call time, and that time actually exists within what was created out of the explosion. So source has become time, become space, and become everything that arises within that framework of time and space. And the framework of time and space is actually within a bigger framework that we can call source. And so source isn't outside looking in at its creation, but rather source has become the planets, has become you and I, has become the victim and the perpetrator, the mountains and the rivers, and has become the flow of the rivers and the falling of the leaves off the tree and the space through which the leaves fall, and the bodies and the brains and the organs, all of that is an expression of God or source, has become that. So everything is God's will. It's a creative experience. Life is the experience of time and space, the experience of being a human being, experiencing life from the point of view of a human being, and a conscious human being, a body with consciousness. An unconscious human being is not an unliberated person. An unconscious human being is the equivalent of a coma or under sedation in an operation. That is a human being that is not conscious. So that gives us an idea of what consciousness in its manifest form is. It's the awareness of life from the perspective of the person. And in order for there to be a person, an experience of a person living life, there is the consciousness, and then that person, the body of the person, has its particular personality, has its particular ideas and intellect. And as part of that, there is this psychological self that gets put in place. And so how the psychological self feels and thinks, how the intellect, the intellect contains both the psychological thoughts and also the functional thinking. So we could call that the thinking mind and the working mind, two parts of the intellect. And so whatever the human being thinks, either psychologically about, let's say, what's happening in the circumstance and how it feels about itself, usually very uncomfortable when circumstance is, let's say, someone not saying nice things about you. How that feels is also destiny. God has become, Source has become that feeling. This is why we hear in Advaita Vedanta, which is the non-dual Hindu path, we hear all there is consciousness. All there is God. Everything is God. God has become everything. And so nothing can happen unless it is God's will. Because God becoming is the creative process. It is the manifestation. So the manifestation, we can say, is the creation. And our normal way of thinking is if there's a creation, there has to be a separate creator. In this case, the creation and the creator are not two. In fact, even in ordinary life as we know it, a master, like take Leonardo da Vinci, Van Gogh, a master produces masterpieces. If they are an absolute master, they can only produce absolute masterpieces. It wouldn't make sense for someone to be an absolute master. Now, that may not be something that a human being can be. I'm just using it for the example. But let's say an artist of some sort in history was an absolute master, then everything that produced would be an absolute masterpiece. And we're very used to thinking of the master and the masterpiece as being separate. But really, the masterpiece is an expression of the master and is not separate from the master. We might say, I can put the masterpiece in one museum and the master is on the other side of the world. And so they are separate. That fact that they are at a point in time physically separate doesn't mean that the masterpiece and the master are separate. It just means they appear to be separate. The masterpiece is an expression of the master, and in the case that I'm describing, it goes a step further. There isn't even a source or God independent of the manifestation. Anyway, these are concepts. They're not necessarily the truth. They're concepts being delivered to the intellect in order for the intellect maybe to change its current ideas that are limiting, and these new ideas are useful in that they can change limiting ideas. They aren't the truth, but the limiting idea is the problem. And this new idea in itself at some point will fall away. Falling away so that something more true is known. And then the descriptions that we put forward are simply the best we can come up with in words. But not necessary when something is known more deeply. So you might wonder, where's all the shoulds and shouldn'ts in all of this? I wanted to reinforce the overlying principle that suggests anything that happens in life is a happening, an output of a creation. Now, it might sound to many people, critical thinkers even, who look at life critically and say, all of this is fantasy, that it's all God's will is fantasy. And in fact, it's quite naive. And I tend to suggest that if that was said, it's said based on the extent of how much that person's thinking about the topic of peace of mind and happiness has happened. Now, it can easily be that these sort of concepts are said by someone who, I guess, believes them and is falling foul of a lot of critical thinking errors. Not seeing that a lot of the concepts that are given, if they're just believed, are not really understood, and therefore that person is, in a way, delusional and could benefit from some critical thinking. However, not all critical thinkers who have seen past the dangers of certain beliefs of God, for example, and maybe even dangers of everything is happening according to God's will, because that information can definitely be absorbed by a seeker or by a person in a way that doesn't lead to positive change, doesn't lead to freedom, doesn't lead to peace of mind, but in fact leads to what we would call new belief systems that support laziness, support irresponsibility, support actions of stealing, for example, or hurting others, all under the guise that it's okay, it's all God's will happening. And frankly, it is, as far as I'm concerned, all God's will happening, because it's happening. However, the teaching is not really there in order to bring about that sort of change or that sort of outcome. It's there because an investigation can take us to a point that doesn't make us lazy, irresponsible. It doesn't allow us to use these concepts as excuses to hurt people, but rather can dissolve the identity that feels like it is in control and feels like its happiness is to be found in the future, out in circumstance. Part of the psychological identity, which is a conceptual sense of self, a whole lot of beliefs about who we are and what we need, how life should be looking in this moment. They really are conceptual ideas that are laid down so slowly and repetitively that in practice they don't at all feel like concepts. Doesn't feel like a conceptual sense of self or a conceptual self. It feels very concrete. It feels very real. And a conceptual sense of self is forced to conceptualize. The initial conceptualization about who it is a deeply ingrained conceptualization, a very unconscious conceptualization that is running consistently and running the same story about who I am, what I need, by enforcing a whole, or running a whole lot of concepts in different environments, in different circumstances. You know, I need you to be polite to me. I need to get this outcome. I need the future to look like that. And it will have that principle of doership and attachment to outcome running in many different subtle variations depending on the circumstance, all of which feeding into this underlying sense of self, and it is a conceptual sense of self, but not experienced as one. And so that conceptual sense of self needs to conceptualize, which really means it knows itself in thought and thinks that thought is reality. It doesn't see that living in a conceptual world with a whole lot of ideas creates a disconnect from something more real. And so a disconnection has happened from the body. A disconnection has happened from being able to feel. And instead, there is a functioning from thought without it being seen or recognized as being a living from thought. It feels like that's the only way to live. It isn't seen to be thought. And so an example that I've used to try and highlight this is that we will answer a question like, how are you feeling? From our concept of how we're feeling. From our concept of how that question is best answered. Rather than pausing, moving attention into the body, which is where we can really feel how we are feeling, recognizing that that feeling is not something I create, but something that is there, and then answering using words that adequately describe what we have come in contact with, i.e. the feeling that we feel in that moment. So that's a very different way of being informed of the answer, of being informed of the answer to the question, how are you feeling? And if the conceptual sense of self has become used to living through thought, which is the default movement, it doesn't even know that that's what's going on. It feels like its answers, its conceptual answers, are somehow the truth. Well, not somehow the truth. It knows it itself is a conceptual self, and so to it, thoughts are real because it knows itself as real, and it is a thought. So a thought is as good as reality. And it's only when a pointer points us into the body and says, we've lost touch with feeling, and we are lost in a conceptual world and a conceptual sense of self. It's only when that notion starts appearing for us in different ways. So Roger might say it in this form, and then we might read something that points to the importance of the body. I think recently, there was a satsang called "The Body is the Doorway," talking about this particular notion. And you might get recommended a video on YouTube, and you play it, and it talks about this topic. And as so happens, then when this starts to happen, we might think this must be important, and usually it's because that's the phase of the journey we're on. And so as we bring attention to the fact, is it true that I'm living in my head and don't even realize it? Is it true that there is a whole dimension of reality that there is a disconnection from? And so dropping into the body may be as simple as being asked to feel what you feel like when someone asks you, how do you feel? Or pose the question to yourself at 10 o'clock in the morning, each morning. Have a little reminder on your phone that comes up, an alarm, how do you feel? And use that as as a little exercise. If all of that happens, it's destiny, right? It sounds like I'm telling you, the doer, to do this. Just new information might become part of your up-to-date conditioning. The programming of the alarm may happen this way. And every morning at 10 o'clock, the alarm says, how do you feel? And are moving into the body and feeling the answer. Instead of saying, oh, I feel very good today, how about you? When in fact we might not be feeling good. The exercise is to come in and realize, there is a whole lot of information. And I'm not making up that information, I'm just tapping into it. And realizing I tap into the information that is part of who I am, but I'm not creating it. And so that strengthens the witness side of us. the side of us that is aware of what is there but doesn't create it. And then that awareness of what is there sees how that might move the body to do something, and then it realizes, oh, the moving of the body in that way was driven by all of these movements and feelings, thoughts as well, that aren't my creation. So anyway, coming into the body, another hint in wisdom teachings talks about this journey being a journey from the head to the heart. And the journey of moving from head to heart, though that 30 centimeter distance is the most valuable journey that we can make, is a metaphor for a shift from the conceptual sense of self to a connection to a self that is of a completely different nature, of a completely different dimension. A dimension that we can say is timeless, formless, spaceless, not of form, not born, not subject to death. And yet it is something that is not known like we might know something separate from ourselves, but rather it can be known intimately, instantaneously known, because there is no distance between what I am and that which is known. They are not two. It is a self-awareness. It is consciousness, the core of what we are, aware of itself. And that consciousness that is aware of itself becomes intimately, it knows intimately that what I am is. What I am exists. And what I am is aware of its own existence. And yet it doesn't define, in that knowing that it exists and in the awareness of its existence, that existence doesn't inform itself of it being anything in particular. It doesn't inform itself of being a body, being a particular gender, having particular preferences. In the silent being, there is the undeniable sense of existence, the undeniable awareness of our own existence. But when I say our own existence, or what I am, that I or that our is not referring to the person, the body that we've always known. It's a much more true, because it is direct, it has got nothing to do with the idea I exist. It is a feeling that is not outside of ourselves. A feeling I am, and it doesn't have any characteristics to it except for the sense of existence and an awareness of its own existence. And that is the movement out of the conceptual sense of self into the heart. Now, when that happens, does daily life stop happening? No. Daily life is destined to carry on until, from the perspective of this individual that knows itself at its core as something outside of this world of form, so for the individual that has reconnected to the core of its being, the impersonal sense of I am, which we could say is the bridge or the junction point between the personal experience of life, the experience from the point of view of this body, mind, organism, and the impersonal consciousness from source. So the I am is the junction point where one turns into the other. Like white light going through a red filter and then red light coming out the other side. The red light and the white light are not separate, but the red light has a different appearance. It is colored by the filter it goes through. And the body is like the filter. And if we come to the heart is the junction point, at the point where the white becomes the red in the metaphor. And so it's the point where we can know our essence and our connection to source most intimately. And there's a freedom in that, because knowing ourselves as that means that we are outside of the world of form. We know that what we are in essence is timeless, eternal, unchanging. So as part of this destiny, this story of life, this conceptual sense of self that believes it needs outcomes in order to be fulfilled, in order for everything to be okay, which isn't the case, because we find our okayness when we connect to this other part of myself, ourself, that is much more true, much more unchanging, self-contented, self-fulfilling, self-knowing. The conceptual sense of self has all of these rules about how it will get the perfection it's looking for, how it will get the contentment which it thinks is found in perfection. And those rules look like, I should do this, I shouldn't do that. You should do this and you shouldn't do that. The world should be like this and it shouldn't be like that. And all of those shoulds and shouldn'ts essentially are the complete forgetting, the complete overlooking that life is one way in each moment, that life is the creation in each moment, and that the good and the bad, the positive traits and the not so positive traits, the development that has happened throughout history and the amazing development and the parts of the development that still could be improved. So the imperfection of life is the perfection of this manifestation. It's imperfectly perfect. It is a whole that is made up of interconnected opposites: wealth and disease, wealth and poverty, health and disease, big and small, hot and cold, good outcomes and not so good outcomes relative to certain benchmarks, pleasure and pain. It's the duality that make up the whole. So it's a non-dual duality. The yin-yang symbol is one of the best representations of that. There is the yin-yang symbol, half black and half white. So that is the duality. But the duality is actually just a distinction of the whole. So it isn't really a separate black and a separate white. It is a single circular singularity that's nature beyond the oneness is duality. Or it's not really beyond, it's not its nature beyond, the expression of the oneness is duality. And we've got lost in the expression and can't see the underlying unity. And sometimes we get to see and then wake up to the underlying unity, and that can obscure us from acknowledging the existence of the duality still. Because when there is an awakening, eventually there is an integration that allows the oneness to be known, and at the same time the duality of experience to be acknowledged, to be seen. That arises as the whole in the expression of duality. And so the conceptual self sets up all of these rules about how it should behave, how it should live life. trying to meet perfection. Now, what that all those shoulds and shouldn'ts are doing is ignoring the fact that life is going to unfold one way, all destiny, and therefore basically looking at life and saying, "Oh, it's not how it should be. It's not how it should be. It should be like this." So there is another separation. It's a psychological separation. Life is, and then the psychology says it shouldn't be. And that psychology that says it shouldn't be creates a resistance with life instead of allowing a flow with life to happen. So whenever decisions about how to live come from our shoulds and shouldn'ts, and when the shoulds and shouldn'ts are in place, basically our whole life is lived based on what should I do next, what shouldn't I do next, rather than receiving instruction from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. And when we're living like that, there is an uncomfortableness, a sense of not being in flow with life. And so the intensive that we just finished was pointing out a whole layer of our concepts that even when we deeply understand, intellectually understand the fact that life is, and that our happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, but rather happiness comes from a connection to self, the true self, a self that is not conceptual, a self that is much more direct and immediate, and what is our true nature. Even with that understanding of everything is God's will, it may not be seen that there are these opposing beliefs still running virtually all the time throughout the day. And if that happens, if those beliefs are in place, and they've been put in place by life, by source, in order for this manifestation to be a manifestation of a psychological conceptual self that is living through a psychological conceptual idea of itself, and therefore having a conceptual set of rules about how to move through life, all of which were put in place by the story in order for that to be the experience. When that's happening, there is an uncomfortableness. There will be a sense that things aren't right. I don't like this. It doesn't feel, it feels off. And as that starts to be recognized, as one's destiny is to recognize it, the recognizing it can lead to living life differently. And that is destiny happening, change happening according to God's will. Now, because the shoulds and shouldn'ts are put in place by destiny, everything is destiny, everything is source. We can't say that the shoulds and shouldn'ts are not instruction from God as to what to do next. They are. The alternative, if it were to happen, and it can't happen until the body-mind organism has been sufficiently changed for that to be the next move, the alternative is to feel. What do I feel like doing in this moment? This is why the connection to the body and a capacity to start feeling, to become more familiar with what the body is saying, that becomes the alternative. It's like, do I feel like having, dinner with this person? And so when the invitation comes, we might see what the answer is. Not in our head. Our head will probably be embarrassed to say no, and then says yes to things and we learn to say, hang on a sec. Maybe we don't feel anything in that moment, and you say, let me get back to, leave it with me. I'll get back to you. And there might not be an answer in that moment or after a day, 2 or 3 days might go past and you're thinking, I think I need to make a decision because it's unfair on the other person, let's say. And maybe there is no, so we'll go to the shoulds or shouldn'ts. Okay, I should make a decision, so, and we'll answer it from our head. And maybe we just need to say, oh, let me send a message saying, I haven't forgotten about it, bear with me a bit longer. Because we don't have an answer. At some point, no answer might mean, maybe it means no. And not having an answer means it's destiny for that not to be an answer. So we can feel like not giving an answer because there isn't one. So the decision to make no decision is in itself a decision. We start to, when we're feeling in, we realize the body is tired, let's say. And so the head, if we're making it from a should, will say yes to something even when we're tired. When we feel into the body and say, what does the body feel like? And the answer then is, oh no, I'm too tired. I'm going to stay home. The shoulds and shouldn'ts are saying, no, don't stay home because you might miss out. I'll come. And so there's a complete disregard for a whole layer of intelligence and a whole layer of information that allows the human being to move much more organically, much more in flow, is being disregarded by the attachment that the psychological self has of what it thinks it needs and how life should be lived. So the conditioning from parents might be, in these situations, the most important thing is to set down roots, to establish yourself, to form a good reputation, to be reliable. All of these things make sense on some level because they are traits that will deliver good outcomes. But they may be traits, if they are not our natural traits, if they are forced by our shoulds and shouldn'ts, they may be movements that will disconnect us. We might be very good at being reliable. We might, the setting of roots, the establishing a reputation may well happen very well. And the likelihood is it will deliver good results. But it may come at a cost. It may mean that we are completely disconnected from a flow that would move us in a very different way. And that different way doesn't mean that if one way delivers good results, that the other way is going to deliver bad results. It may mean that we move in a different way that feels like such a relief, feels so much more authentic. This whole topic is about authenticity, really. And not only does it feel more authentic, feel more in flow, feel so much more of a relief to be able to move with what is congruent with what we are at a deep level, it may also deliver fantastic results. So as part of what I saw at the time was they are both instructions from God, what we feel like doing and what we think we should and shouldn't do. One, in my experience, delivered a disconnection, created an uncomfortableness, created a timetable in life that was crammed in, made the body move at a very quick pace. There was much more stress because that was what was assumed to be how life had to be lived in order for there to be success and happiness. Or for there to be success and therefore happiness. And the alternative, the shift, when there was who says that is how life has to be lived? It's the thinking mind that says this. And when we prioritize peace of mind, when we prioritize connection, then we start allowing ourselves to make decisions from what I'm describing as a more flowing, more natural, more authentic place. And all of the things that were absent start to present themselves in this new way of living life. So in closing, I'd also mention that this feeling, do what we feel like, doesn't mean just feeling bodily sensations of hunger, of tiredness, of pleasure or pain. They're a very important part. If we're tired, it may mean that most of the time sleeping is the most appropriate thing. However, the working mind, not the thinking mind says this is how it should be, and it disregards everything else, all the other inputs. The working mind, on the other hand, can contribute information that will become part of what we feel like doing. So we might be very tired. We might need to go to a wedding, let's say, and the wedding might be of my sister or brother. And if I felt just the bodily sensation and did what that said alone, it says I'm tired, and we say I'm not going to go to the wedding. However, the working mind might throw in this information saying, this is your sister's big day. She would very much appreciate that you're there. It might hurt her not to be there, and so that's information being thrown in by the working mind. The working mind doesn't say, given that's the fact, you have to disregard everything else and you have to go. That would be what the thinking mind says. The working mind says, just throwing this into the mix so that it is part of the information, along with the information that the body is tired. And without shoulds and shouldn'ts, we allow all of that to be there, and then a feeling of what to do comes up. And the feeling may be, yes, I understand it's likely to hurt her, or it's going to be important for her, but I'm too tired and I'm not going to go. Or the information, the feeling might be, I want to go. I feel like going even though I'm tired. So on one level, I don't feel like going, on the level of just the bodily sensation. But as an overall, I feel like going. So this move is something that we learn as we start trying. It's like riding a bike. You start off wobbly and falling off. And with practice, the whole change refines, and what we end up with is living in such a way that we can say, in each moment in my life, I always do exactly what I feel like doing. And that can sound very selfish. It can sound like it's going to be very irresponsible. But what we might find is that what we feel like doing includes things that are not selfish and not irresponsible. And they feel natural. They say, yes, I want to do this. Not I should. I don't feel obligated to do it. I feel like doing it. So there was a lot of talking today. I'll take one. I don't know if anyone has a question. There's one hand up there now, so I'll take that question. Cecilia, I think. Hi, Cecilia.
It's taken me, I think, all my adult life to get to this point, including the transition of my husband 2 years ago and continuing his journey. And I find myself now just surrendering more and more and more and more and more and more just to the unfolding of life. I'm grateful for that. Very grateful.
Oh,
and so I understand, not interested in any outcomes. I'm just, the more I can surrender, the more at peace I am. the thing is that I want to ask you is how does one then reconcile that with the demands of supposedly having to make these decisions? Like, I'm a teacher, so I have to work to earn my living. So I try and live as much as possible outside of that, just doing what I precisely want to do. I'm at my point now where I'm not going to be doing anything that I don't want to do anymore. But because there is this sort of logistical aspect of my form and having to operate as a form still. How do I reconcile, like, when I'm asked to make decisions? Because I know I'm not making any decisions, if you see what I mean. Like, in terms of, as you say, it really is God's will, and the more I give myself to that, the better I am. But then, how do I reconcile that when being forced to make some decisions? Yeah, I don't.
Yeah,
You
so
understand? Like, so not that I'm in battle with myself, because I'm not anymore. I don't want that. But how do I address that? Is that God's will as well, that at every moment that unfolds, if I am faced with the logistical thing, then I address it as part of that destiny, as part of that surrender. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. It's difficult to talk about these things.
sure, it's a nuance. I would say that a concept that can be very useful is to see that God's will unfolds through what we might call my will. And in saying that, we need to appreciate that what I'm referring to as my will really is God's will, and see that my will and God's will are not two things. So in order for destiny to unfold, it happens, as I said, not through God's hand coming down and moving all of the, pawns, but rather by the pawns functioning a particular way. And so what previously I used to see as my decision, I now see as a decision happening through me, which feels like my decision, so I can call it my decision. But at the same time, I realize that what I'm calling my decision is God's will happening. And then the conundrum falls away. It's like, oh, God's will has always been happening through my will, which is not really my will, and the other's will, which is not really the other's will. So decision making is the mechanism by which God's will unfolds. So we often think, when we grasp everything as God's will, that decisions don't have a place. In fact, that if I'm making a decision, I'm forgetting that everything is God's will. But rather, it's about our attitude towards our decisions changing such that our decisions are seen to be God's will happening. So your decision to continue to work, for example, or to stop working, will always unfold according to destiny. And so whatever you decide is the only thing you can decide, and you can't make a mistake. You can make a mistake if we look at it relative to an outcome, because it could be that you decide to stop working, and then the outcome of that might prove to mean that financially there's a problem. The assessment of things was, let's say, off what you thought, and then the outcome is not so great. But the fact that the outcome is not so great doesn't mean that that wasn't God's will, because God's will includes sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And it includes your journey being what it is, which may mean a journey from financial stability to a point where there is less financial stability. And who knows what that will lead to. It may lead to very positive change in some regard. as well as, let's say, the inevitable pain of having less financial stability. So the fact that the outcome is sometimes not that great doesn't mean it wasn't God's will. Sometimes we think, oh, I made that choice, the outcome wasn't great, and that happened because I wasn't following God's will. And I'd say, no, that's not how I look at it. It's not how the understanding of non-duality looks at it. And whatever decision someone makes is God's will. So I found in my circumstance that if I was living decisions from a place of fear, which also would be God's will, but when I was making decisions from a place of fear, a sense that if I didn't have those outcomes, if I don't get those outcomes, it'll be absolutely disastrous, then there was an uncomfortableness. And I think a lot of people, and I sense in yourself, that has been felt, and we move to a more open way of living, where in my feeling of it, it's like I'm being lived. In each moment, when a decision needs to be made, I wait for the answer. There may be some thinking about it, but I see the thinking as impersonal, based on, that's the faculty that has been given. There's a circumstance that is part of life that I didn't create, and then the faculty of thought thinks about it, and eventually an answer comes, and I just wait for that answer, and then I feel like I am being lived. I'm being moved by the answers that come up, by the urges that come up, by the feelings that come up, rather than being lived from a set of rigid shoulds and shouldn'ts. And as I said, one feels much more authentic than the other, but essentially they're both, to me, different forms of instruction from God.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Now it's much clearer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very
Good.
much.
You're very welcome. So thank you. Sorry to the other hands. I'm going to keep it to the 2 hours today, and I appreciate everyone joining. So if anyone is interested in a more detailed exposition of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, it really is a very freeing component of the journey, and I feel that it's where the understanding really starts to go deep, because we can't just stay in the conceptual understanding. This changing of shoulds and shouldn'ts means questioning the jobs we're in, means questioning the relationships we're in. It means questioning how we answer questions, what we say yes to, and making small changes to start with. The ones that is where we're getting our stability, a bit like riding the bike on very flat ground where there's nothing to hit, where it's safe, maybe using the training wheels. Starting with small decisions, the principle starts to become more apparent. The feeling of freedom, even in the small, doing small things differently, is felt. And then the progression can be such that our whole life gets rejigged in such a way that from a certain point on, we're making more and more, and eventually all of our decisions from a place of being informed that is very different to where we were informed from previously. So